I will give a general survey of the field, not only the military terrain. The most important development, in my opinion, is not only the silence of the eastern side of Aleppo and their falling into the hands of Daesh or ISIS. The last phase, if we consider it to be the last phase, it could be lengthy. It could be 2 years or 3 years of continuous violence at different rates, in different regions, in one form or another, and between different militants. But it seems that we have crossed an important point, and we are about to be launched into a change. The reason for that is due to the radical change in the Turkish policies after the failed coup last July. This was clearly a challenge before Erdogan and his ruling party. It required from them a certain response through controlling the internal affairs of the army, the police, the government institutions, and other sectors as well. Although it was clear that Erdogan had direct win by deep-rooting his control and paving the way towards the ambition of transformation from a parliamentary system to a presidential system in Turkey. Yet, these successes came at a very high price, with the resignation of 40% of leading officers in the Turkish army, and this requires years in order to reform the Turkish army, in addition to what happened in the judiciary and the police. And we would like to add that the Turkish economy was witnessing a certain regression even from before July, to the extent that there are some rumors that state that in the future the banking sector also will suffer in Turkey. So all of these issues in the army, in the security level, and in the economy will require from Erdogan and his political party years of reform, reconstruction, rehabilitation, etc. So it seems to me that the main transformation in the Turkish policies after last July, in the foreign policies towards mitigating contradictions and oppositions through settling the situation and the relation with Russia, the change in the relation with Israel and inside Syria is all a must. And we have seen this after July, how Turkey transferred thousands of its militants from Aleppo towards another region for the service of the Turks. So we can say that the Turkish interests, even if the direction of the Turkish policy has changed in terms of foreign affairs, especially towards Syria, I believe that when it comes to the Syrian opposition, especially in Syria, whether it is the combating opposition or not, they have had the collateral damage and thus they cannot go back. Consequently, I believe that the upcoming period, even if it is highly complex, even if we do have a tug-of-war taking place between the Assad regime, the Kurds, the opposition, despite all that, I believe that within this tug-of-war, Turkey will remain walking towards the same direction in the near future. These all have political and economic repercussions. The first of which is, for example, the Geneva process which is the diplomatic process, has lost its chance to reach any peaceful solution, as Geneva never had this insight for us. As for the Astana process for negotiations, which started by the end of last year, I believe that the different stakeholders will not be able to reach a formal, official political agreement, but this process has become a framework for a dialogue between these parties on current field affairs and issues. For example, coordinating air movement, coordinating the work in northern Aleppo. So the fields where Turkey, Iran, Russia, and the armed opposition in Syria come together in order to reorganize and renegotiate these field affairs that are short-term or that take place on a daily basis. But this will not make us reach a formal or official political agreement, but it will set minimum lines and maximum lines. What is left in Idlib and the west of the Aleppo Reef and south of Huran and in Palmyra, we see that the whole process has become restricted. And the conduct of Turkey in the north especially will influence greatly the regions of the opposition, because Turkey is in control of the supply and the humanitarian aid and regular trade from its checkpoints. And of course, in my opinion, I think we could open the road from Azaz in the north towards the Nasib checkpoint, and we would be able to regain land trade all throughout. And we can see that through activating trade towards the south by opening the borders there. And this will help the local producers who are currently exporting from Horan to other regions in Syria. And this will improve communication in the future, in the near future, not only inside Syria, but also with Turkey through certain agreements that Turkey and Russia would mediate for, whether with the Kurds or in Azaz. We have seen this recently with Russia. It came to an agreement with the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Kurdish entities to have Manbij under the umbrella of Syria with a headquarters in Damascus. So this means that there is a higher level of political coordination, and we can even see even more happening.
الثاني اللي بحب اتطرق له هون يعني كرد على يعني الافق الميداني واللي بيعكس بالنهايه الموازين.
So there is a reflection here of what was happening in the last 2 or 3 years at least, especially last summer, that within these field and strategic conditions, had I been in the shoes of Bashar al-Assad, I wouldn't see a necessity to reach any formal agreement. It seems that the regime, since the beginning of the crisis so far, they are resisting any kind of formal solution where we have stakeholders from outside Syria. In all of his interviews, he always talks about sovereignty all over again. He talks about the sovereign Syrian state with a constitution, people's choices, etc. So to say, at the end of the day, that, as he says, he doesn't need any foreign forces, even friendly foreign forces, for the Syrians to come to an agreement or a conciliation. And I think that Currently, he doesn't even need foreign guarantee for legitimacy, whereby the internal political structure is defined. I add to this that any agreement which includes the sharing of power could give legitimacy to the opposition and the demand of sharing and participating in the authority. And thus, they would say, why have we fought for 5 years to share authority, though we could have reached that after 1 year only? So this final phase may be lengthy. There could be battles here and there. If the Astana process was able to reach more agreements, violence could decrease. And if there is a broader agreement between Damascus and Jordan, we could have certain understandings that would reach ceasefire in the south. What I'm trying to describe to you, in other terms, is the method of reaching certain agreements and conciliations in certain spots which are violent, to a much broader conciliation with the Idlib province, for example, or the Daraa region, with the opposition in these regions. Because the Nusra Front and the armed opposition are different, so the different regions and those governing them are different. So once again, this could be a lengthy process. It could be timely. One of the scenarios we could reach is for the Syrian regime to remain firm on its position and little by little start assimilating opposition blocks or regions and joining them again under the umbrella of the Ministry of Defense. Let's say if there are militants, they will join, for example, the 4th Brigade or the 5th Brigade that were established in the last year, similarly with the other local councils. Because there is a precedent that was set, and I think that this will serve the regime politically. And to conclude, I still have not mentioned the United States. It seems that many are awaiting a certain new political position from the White House and the Donald Trump administration very soon. And it is very clear that recently there was an escalation of field American presence in the north of Syria. We've seen American flags on the different vehicles and the addition of 400 soldiers in Manbij and their work with the Democratic Syrian forces. I believe that the escalation of the Trump administration on the field will remain towards fighting Daesh or ISIS, either in discourse or in action, because Trump has promised he will fight Daesh. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there is an intent to change the Syrian conflict internally. On the contrary, what happened around Manbij is a clear indicator. We see that there is an American-Russian rapprochement to create a kind of a dam or an obstacle towards the progress towards the east of the Euphrates. So we see more American flags, more soldiers. We see an agreement with the Manbij City Council and the Syrian regime. All these show that there is a rapprochement to put an end to the situation there. I'd like to go back to Turkey to say that Turkey is now before an easy choice, that in Syria, even when it comes to the Syrian Kurds, the thing has been settled. There's no indirect or direct penetration of the Turks towards Raqqa. And this means that since Turkey is currently going towards strategic withdrawal from the Syrian struggle, we may reach a situation whereby, as long as Turkey is appeased that Kurdish independence will be limited within the autonomy of the Syrian state and it will not cross its borders, then Turkey will accept that. I think that this is what will happen because Turkey doesn't have a choice yet. I think we will reach a phase when the Democratic Kurdish Union with the Assad regime and under the sponsorship of Russia and or the United States and or Turkey will reach a certain agreement that is plausible for both parties. In this way, Turkey will separate itself from the Syrian issue and it will not be influenced by the Kurdish situation. What remains is to say that before or after the survey that will take place in Turkey in April on the transformation of the regime or the system in Turkey from being parliamentary to presidential, we will see diplomatic escalation as we have seen between Turkey, London and other European capitals. Let us wait till after the referendum to see the result. Whether the result is for Erdogan, then at least he will have an option, he will have a choice. I have decreased the threat of the Kurdish Kurdish threat, and thus we will see whether they will escalate against the PKK or the other way around. He may not need to do so, taking into account the crisis that the Turkish army finds itself in. Perhaps the only solution will be to appease the situation inside Turkey and to reopen a dialogue there. No matter what, I think that little by little Turkey will withdraw from the internal process in Syria, or the internal situation in Syria, and those inside will have either to migrate or to join the reconciliations that will take place with the Assad regime. And this could take 1, 2, or 3 years. But based on what we see on the field today and at the regional and international levels, I think that this is the scenario that will be waiting us. Thank you.
آخر واحد. مرحبا.
Hello. First of all, allow me to thank the Carnegie Center for inviting me for the third or fourth time. I wanted to focus on the Syrian opposition and the future of this opposition in Syria in light of the introduction presented by Mr. Yezid. It seems that we are witnessing negative indicators regarding the future of the opposition in the upcoming months and years in Syria. There is a feeling that the opposition ended. But before tackling this issue, allow me to go back to analyze what does Syrian opposition mean on the social and economic levels. Because Syrian opposition, according to me, is a socio-economic movement
the power it had during the past 6 years is directly related to the socioeconomic structure in Syria. Allow me to divide the opposition into three categories, and some of you might not agree, but I think that this is my personal opinion. I would divide the opposition into three categories. First of all, the idealists, those secular persons who have organized the demonstration at the beginning and who participated themselves to these demonstrations. They had idealistic objectives, living in freedom, getting rid of the police state, etc. And we also have very important figures in the political sphere who have joined this idealistic movement supporting freedom and the state of law. The second category cannot be summarized as in one terminology, but I have chosen the terminology of the poor people or miserables. They are the major component on a quantitative level of the Syrian opposition. And these poor persons have participated to the demonstrations with the idealists, but with time they opted for using weapons because they thought that these demonstrations will lead nowhere. And after the communication with foreign powers, they have decided to opt for violence, and I will explain later on why. The third category is called the go-betweens, or the political opposition, the National Council, the coalition, the coordination committee, the higher council for opposition, etc. So all these persons are considered go-betweeners or moderators between the foreign will and what could be implemented on the field in Syria. So we can say that the idealists was a strong movement in the beginning because all countries adopted this speech, but a year or a year and a half after the beginning of the demonstrations, this group became less powerful, and some of these idealists were sent to jail or were silenced by the opposition itself, like Raza al-Zaytouni in eastern Ghouta. The majority of these persons have been imprisoned in al-Assad jails, and the opposition played its role in terminating the intervention of this movement. So I think that this movement decreased from a political perspective. The miserables or the poor people wanted to privatize the state, but they wanted to adopt privatization in an arbitrary manner. For example, I live in a poor village where I do not have access to resources, and then I have other factories in close villages. Then I will go and exert my monopoly over this region in order to sell the natural resources present in these villages. And This is why we witnessed the emergence of so many movements and factions who wanted to end the Assad regime, but who also wanted to privatize the state and to exert their monopoly over the resources of the state, because they did not have access previously to this national wealth. A person living in Deir ez-Zor, for example, where we have so many oil resources, yet persons are very poor. All these countries and all these villages, excuse me, were poor villages where people lost their economic power, especially during the last 11 years. I'm talking about the reef of Aleppo, of Idlib as well, where the GDP is very low and decreased during the past decade, while the situation is different in Aleppo and in other cities. So these regions have been managed or controlled by these poor people who felt they were the victim of this regime mafia. So this was initially what they wanted to obtain. And they wanted to have access to the natural resources of the state and to obtain financial benefits in order to invest them personally or in other countries like Turkey and Egypt. With time, some of these armed factions have taken all what can be taken, and at the end of the day, the resources perished, so they had recourse to the international or the foreign interference, and this is how the Turkish people started supporting these factions, because at the end of the day, the cake is not big enough with the number of factions of movements who were acting on the field in Syria, and many didn't find a role for themselves. This is why they started obtaining financial support from outside. The go-betweens, as I said, are persons who joined the opposition and who live abroad, and they have a relationship with Europe and the United States. Their objective is to implement the international will or the Arab will in Syria. So they look at the international will and they try to implement it according to this comparison approach. They wanted the Libyan model to be implemented in Syria, which means foreign interference, and then the establishment of the Syrian National Council, similar to the Libyan National Council, but the foreign superpowers did not interfere, and this is why this scenario was not implemented. And currently, the negotiations in Geneva aim at ensuring this coexistence under the appellation of a transitory committee. So what is the future of these three categories, the idealists, the miserables, and the go-betweens? I think that the idealists will come back to play a role, because I think that we are currently witnessing a new a new revival of this democratic and pluralistic speech. It is different from the Islamic speech that led to so many issues, and I think that the majority of foreign countries do not want the Assad regime to fail anymore. And this is a speech that is being absorbed by many stakeholders, including the opposition. When the Nusra movement changes its name and stops its relationship with Al-Qaeda, then changes its name again within 6 months, this means that there is an issue in this fundamentalist and jihadi speech in Syria, which means that these factions are trying to have a national umbrella over their project, and this is what we have witnessed during the last speech that was delivered by these movements, and that used a national approach. So I think that the National Front that was declared in Beirut, Al-Hussein and his fellows, represent the beginning of the comeback of these idealists. The poor will be again divided into 3 categories. And I mean those who used weapons and those who didn't. Those who used weapons will be divided into 2 categories. First of all, those who are linked to Jordan and Turkey, and therefore who will only be present in Dar'a, in the reef of Idlib, and in Aleppo. While the other category is formed of persons who are using internal resources, internal trade, etc. Those will continue being present and might change their military strategy in order to focus on interventions in Homs, for example, such types of intervention that can attract the media and attract investors in order to offer their support. The third category is the biggest. Those who are living in refugee camps in Jordan, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And I think that 80% of them will not go back to Syria. This is my personal conviction. Those who have children will not be able to go back to Syria because their children were born in Jordan or Lebanon and are enrolled in schools there. Regarding the go-betweens, I also think that this group will be divided into 3 categories. Some will have reconciliation with the regime. Others will have opted for being from the opposition. They will be waiting for the suitable moment in order to go back to the field. This is my personal opinion regarding this matter. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I was asked to focus on the future vision in case Assad remains in power. And I'll go back to that in a minute. First, allow me to comment what the previous speakers mentioned. Dr. Yezid spoke about an important point, which is the transformation in the Turkish policy towards itself and towards Syria. This was a breaking point in the transformation of the conflict in Syria, but this was not the only factor, as there have been other factors that have been accumulating in the last year and a half, which led to what we have seen, the most important of which was the reaction of the Syrian regime itself towards the expansion of Iranian power and its inability to control it inside Syria in its different forms, and thus they asked assistance from Russia in order to put an end to this power. Secondly, we have the decrease in oil prices and what is happening in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, in addition to the change in the support for the resistance. Then we have the mixing between resistance and terrorism, as Mr. Malik mentioned. Is it a perception, a misunderstanding which led to the support of certain countries such as Qatar? It tried to change the course of events, as we have seen in the last few months. Now, instead of supporting the resistance, they want to hold them accountable. We have heard about directing financial capacities and the holding of accountable of those carrying arms by the international community on the other hand. And we see also the focus of different kinds of aid rather than direct aid to the resistance. What we've seen in the east of Aleppo, and I will talk about it later on, we have seen great pressure exerted on Jordan, and the failure of Jordan intervention, especially in regards what it was not able to do with Israel and other countries of the region. Knowing that the foreign debt of Jordan is 100% of the local production, and this led to further pressure on Jordan. And it led to changing in the Jordanian vision, including the different visits that took place by Jordanian officers to Syria. Yezid also mentioned the freeing up of trade from Turkey to the Gulf through Jordan as well. All of these factors came together and led to the situation we find ourselves in today. And this situation is there is no longer a victor's peace. What we have is a solution through negotiations and through a kind of sharing of power. All the different indicators today show that Assad could remain in power following this formula. Now, if he has a role to play according to this formula, the first thing that we will see is secret transactions in addition to the announced transaction. For the secret transactions, I mean transactions and agreements between Assad and other countries of the region, and at the level of the idealists, the go-betweeners, the poor, and all of these will not be written, but they will be effective in the progress of the Syrian state post this agreement or post the solution. This, in my opinion, will lead to the failure of any attempt to reconstruct Syria effectively and efficiently. These agreements will also put before us several scenarios for the return of the refugees and the displaced. I think that they will be displaced once again back home, so they will not have the option, for example, to go back and put their children in schools and work with NGOs. I think that there will be an attempt to bring them back, especially from Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And I think that the international community will work on this front, but this will lead to another displacement for them. Some of the solutions that the fighters have reached today, such as the Arab belt next to or surrounding Kurdistan, but these are solutions that are 40 or 50 years old, so they are not actually true solutions that we will find at the political level. The status quo at this level will continue, and many communities will not be allowed to go back to their original regions. As for reconstruction, the cost they mention is between 170 billion to $1 trillion. And it all depends on what we estimate to be the reconstruction period and whether we calculate the lost opportunities of Syria in the last 5 years or not. But in general, I think that there will be a lack in resources, especially financial resources or cash. The United States has already declared that it's not interested in reconstructing Syria, and they tried to put this responsibility in Russia, but Russia doesn't have the resources required for the reconstruction of Syria. So once again, the European Union and the Gulf will be viewed as the reconstructors of Syria. They will have to find a radical solution for the refugees crisis after they have failed to make Turkey a buffer zone for the refugees. Now, to ask them to reconstruct Syria will be in order to keep the refugees, or the Syrians, excuse me, inside Syria. As you know, a country like Qatar had $5 billion facilities the day the war erupted in Syria. And they had agreements with the Syrian state, and this came to an end because of the corruption and because of other factors that the Qatari did not accept. And these factors are still there. So, with the clandestine agreements with the regime, I think that the level of corruption will increase. The sector which will be revived in Syria is the private sector, in fact, partly because there is a group that was able to accumulate wealth during the war, and partly because the private sector had been active in Syria after the failure of the Syrian state in investment field, and thus the private sector played an important role. But the private sector, of course, will go to where we have more security, more stability, and greater profit-making opportunities. And this, of course, will overlap with the capabilities present in the main cities, all the way from Dira to Aleppo to other cities. And as Malik mentioned, the regions that were marginalized prior to the war will remain marginalized, and because there are some Islamist, extremist, terrorist pockets there. which will slow down the reconstruction phase at least 2 times or even 3 times. When it comes to the administrative structure of Syria, it all depends on the nature of agreement that will be reached if Assad remains in power and everyone agrees that Syria is one sovereign state, as no one now is calling for the division of Syria in any way or form. Thus, we will see a higher decentralization in Syria, especially in Idlib, in Raqqa, to the extent that they will have almost self-determination or self-governance. This, in the medium and long run, will lead to difficult reconstruction circumstances or conditions, especially when it comes to state revenues and how to collect these revenues at the level of these regions and the tax return, knowing that tax return in Syria was weak and patchy. Public servants, some public servants pay, others don't, etc. So all these problems will continue, and they may even double if what we expect will happen. The main issue will be, if Assad continues in his position, is the issue of national reconciliation. We always forget that there is more than 50% of the population who are pro-Assad. Not all residents in, or not all the citizens of Syria are against Assad. Some are with him due to certain personal interests. But it's much less than the majority required to allow him to continue to remain in power in a transitional phase. So these are the problems that will be faced by the Syrian administration, and an important factor will reflect on reconstruction is that Assad will not be pardoned 100%. Even if he remains in power, the international community will always demand things from him. They will follow sanctions or others against him or against the government, and this will lead to a slowdown in the reconstruction and in the rising of Syria as a new state. An important issue in the transitional phase is the issue of security and the restructuring of the Syrian armed forces, in addition to creating opportunities to the thousands who fought against the state. This will be a pivotal point that is dialectical and that is problematic. It didn't happen in Iraq, it didn't happen anywhere else in the world. Taking into account what Mr. Malik mentioned, there are even differences or different levels of participation in the resistance. If these are not solved 5 or 6 years from now, these people will go back to these marginalized regions. They will have other upheavals and they will create more revolutions. Thank you. I have a quick question to Malik. Regarding the difficult negotiations in Geneva and Astana, on the opposite side we have this course of internal reconciliations, especially in Hage, where a Russian battalion was involved. So does this have a relationship with the military path
And what is the impact of Geneva negotiations on these reconciliations? How can the relationship between the regime and the international community be restored? Thank you. First of all, I prefer not to use the terminology reconciliation. It is used by the Syrian regime in order to hide something else. I prefer to call it
من أبناء هذه المناطق
a surrender of those who have accepted the current situation, opposed to those who refuse to live in such conditions. So this is a type of surrender, and it is normal for these things to happen. These regions like Hay al-War, like Daraya, and Muaddamiye are under siege. And this is why the situation remained as is, and at the end of the day, those inhabitants were unable to survive, especially under the military attack that was targeting the opposition as well as the civilians. And this is what happened in War and in Homs and other regions. Do you think that other regions will join? We are not talking about a reconciliation. We do not have a national path parallel to Geneva. I think that this is a military strategy, and this is a control being tightened on these villages and on these pockets, the biggest being Eastern Ghouta. So if the regime exerts its control over Eastern Ghouta, then we will only have Ghastan, Talbise and Houle as the last big pocket to a certain extent under the control of the opposition. We also have northern and southern regions who have support from Turkey and Jordan. Otherwise, the remaining regions will be under the control of the regime. Let me ask this question in another manner. If we were to analyze this surrender or this reconciliation, can we expect similar things taking place in Al-Ghouta? Yes, of course. So you think that this year, of course, I am positive the opposition will have to surrender, especially if it is not supported by the neighboring regions due to their geographic location. So this is partly linked to Geneva, where we have some support being given to the Syrian regime, and of course, those who went from the opposition want to reach a political settlement, but at the end of the day, they do not have any pressure they can exert. This is why this series of surrenders are not giving sufficient power to the Geneva process. They also entered Aleppo. I'm talking about Chechen groups, yes, and the Russian judicial police as well, in order to make citizens feel appeased. They just wanted to appease the citizens regarding the fact that the regime will not enter these regions and kill everybody. But at the end of the day, we will have a vendetta. Regarding the topic related to a military confrontation, you mentioned in an article that you have previously published that the Tahrir al-Sham movement has its control over the northern regions. Do you think that this monopoly will expand? Not necessarily, but it is clear that the major issue in this western northern province is related to the presence of al-Nusra Front or the Damascus Liberation Front. If Turkey is asking the opposition to come to Astana or to commit to any type of resolution, then in this case, what will happen to these villages and these regions should the regime decide to continue in its military strategy? So what will they do? Will they remain neutral, even if all the international powers are targeting the jihadis in these regions where we also have non-jihadis? So at the end of the day, these regions will be under the control of the regime. What is the second option? Can we stop the jihadis in order to be able to ensure protection for these non-jihadis? I think that the choice is very difficult, and this is why I have said that this immigration to Turkey or the decision to surrender will be the easiest option. After Astana, it became more difficult to go backwards, and later on this will be followed by other steps. So with each step, it will become harder for the opposition to go backwards. Previously, they did not imagine to talk with the regime about possible solutions, and now these things are becoming more realistic, and this will be the case when additional steps will be made by the opposition. This is a dynamic that will evolve. You talked about superpowers like Russia, and you also mentioned Turkey and other countries. And here I would like to talk about the reconstruction and the position of Europe. I think that the European Union is discussing the reconstruction. How will it support Syria, and under which conditions will it participate to this reconstruction? Several European countries think that they will not ensure any type of assistance if the regime prevails. And I think that Foreign Minister Mogherini is focusing on solving the issue of refugees and supporting Jordan and Lebanon amidst this refugee crisis. And this requires stability in Syria, and millions need assistance in Syria. So all these arguments will be used in order to change the opinion of the European Union and to launch these initial assistance programs. Let us not forget that 70% of this assistance was channeled to Syria, with the majority being channeled towards the regions under the control of the regime. So I think that this will continue, but now we do not have a clear political settlement like the Oslo Agreement, for example, where we do not have all the stakeholders agreeing upon one opinion. I think that Turkey can have a role to play, and the Syrian regime will also have its role to play, but the situation is very ambiguous because we have this war against ISIS, and then we have villages where we still have military confrontation, and other regions where we have stability to a certain extent. Let us not forget the issue related to the Europeans and the Americans. The Europeans prefer to start offering this assistance. Yes, but even if they decide to do so, they will have their conditions similar to what they have did in other countries, which means counting on the civil society and the local as well as international NGOs. But those organizations are very modern in Syria because they have all been established during the war, and I think that this will lead to the decrease in the sovereignty of the state. The last question is related to the Kurdish issue and the presence of 400 Marines in Syria. How will this affect the situation of the Kurdish and their ability to become independent? I think that this has several reasons. This American movement has several reasons. First of all, President Trump wants to do something because he promised to win over ISIS, and additional resources from the American administration were channeled towards the region without any clarification regarding the American objective. I know that many human, military, and intelligence resources have been mobilized before clarifying the objective of this mission. So the objective is not yet clear even for Americans. Regarding the Kurdish issue, it is clear in Manbij, for example, or in the agreement that led to the entry of the regime to Tel Rifat, for example. This is a Kurdish region, but 4 villages were open to the entry of the Syrian regime, with the acceptance of the Kurdish. So I think that they have finally decided to work in a pragmatic way. What I mean is that if they agree upon the fact that al-Assad regime will remain and that it will be more beneficial for them to have this positive relationship with the regime, then they might accept to be present under the umbrella of the regime. But I'm not sure what type of autonomy they will have access to. We have analyzed several options for decentralization or administrative autonomy or other options. I think that this will be the result of an agreement between Turkey, Russia, and the Assad regime. And Turkey repeated that no Kurdish state will see the light in Syria. They think and they claim that they will prevent this state from being established. So I think that we will reach an agreement to a certain extent. And Turkey is trying to separate between the Kurdish issue within Syria and the Kurdish issue in Turkey. And this might lead to a type of reconciliation between the Kurdish people and any form of state or authority in Syria. First of all, we have focused a lot on the opposition. We did not talk about the regime or the Syrian government. The regime have suffered from several weaknesses during the past 6 years, especially on the financial level. This is why it is unable to fund the war, thus having recourse to military factions from Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and other countries. And many experts, as well as myself, consider that without these factions, the regime will not be able to sustain the war. The second thing it was taken by the regime is similar to what the category of poor people did, exerting power and tightening control over regions rich in natural resources, and is selling these resources in order to survive. But what will remain from this Syrian state after 2 to 3 years? Not a lot, from my personal perspective, and this is why I think that those who will govern Syria after the war will be, at the end of the day, a group of investors and a group of businessmen supported by big countries. The businessmen being supported by the regime and others supported by the opposition. So we will reach a pragmatic settlement, and all relevant stakeholders will have their advantages and benefits guaranteed. I will ask you to ask questions, if any, but please present yourselves before asking your question. I'm the former Minister of Agriculture, Adel Kurtas, from Lebanon. This meeting is very important, but I was expecting, after this valuable discussion, to hear something about the future of Syria. They are meeting in Geneva and they will meet in Astana, but where are they going? An-Nahar said that until now 430,000 persons lost their lives in Syria. So what is the outcome of all these meetings? If we leave it to the Syrians, be it the regime or the opposition, it will be impossible for them to reconcile. We did not talk about Iran, we did not talk about Russia today. We did not talk about the United States, about the European Union. What is their opinion regarding the Syrian conflict and the future of Syria? My name is Mohanad Sbaiti. I'm a professor at AUB. Professor Yezid, you said that they wanted al-Assad to remain in order for them to be able to combat the terrorist groups. But once this war will end, what will justify the presence of al-Assad? Regarding the strategic Turkish role, you said that it is an irreversible position, but what could make it reversible? We will answer these first questions. Let's take another question, please. Former Minister Rojedib, can we say today that al-Assad regime can represent the coalition between Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia or not? We are interested in knowing what is happening on the Lebanese borders with Syria and the Golan region, for example, if possible. Rim Turkmani from LSE. I have a question to Mr. Yezid. You said that political solution in Geneva is impossible, but can you explain why? Do you think that in spite of all, wouldn't Geneva be the only possible platform where all relevant stakeholders can meet? I do not agree with Yezid regarding the solution. The solution will take time and requires concessions. What happened in Astana is very important because at least people are not dying with the same rhythm, if I may say. And we shouldn't remain idealistic. Let's agree upon the fact that the situation today is better than it was in the past. Regarding the future of Syria and the possible agreements. I don't think that there is a long-term agreement between Russia, Turkey, and Iran. We have an agreement for coordination purposes, and even this coordination failed because they do not know how to deal with one another, and we have seen what happened in Aleppo, where they were unable to coordinate the withdrawal properly. So the objective is to reach a solution or to stop the war, but I do not think that this can be considered as an alliance similar to the possible alliance that could be concluded between the United States and Russia. Remember that Trump used to criticize Obama because he talks a lot and he does not act. And he promised not to talk and to act. So this is the only consistent thing that we have witnessed since the beginning of his campaign. The presence of 2,000 US officers is a true sign of this commitment. I'm sure that he has a plan, he has a military plan, hopefully, and let us wait and see what will happen on the field. Regarding what Tuat said about buffer zones or safe zones in Syria, and Malik talked about these regions in the northern area. It could become a safe zone, and it could also be used as an incentive for the opposition to offer additional concessions compared to what is being offered currently in Geneva. Thank you. Someone asked a question regarding the future of Syria. I think that Syria will transform into a big Lebanon. Maybe a decade later, Syria will go back to its natural state. Some might not agree with me when I say that Lebanon is a natural state where we have several communities living together. We have a freedom of speech and freedom of a political commitment and expression to a certain extent. But Syria was living in frustration during the past 40 to 50 years, but I think that it will go back to the era before al-Ba'ath Party, as it is the case in Lebanon, where we have political parties, we have heads of tribes and others having access to the parliament and being presented in the parliament. This will be the case in Syria after the war. The warlords will also be represented, and the gang leaders will also become parliamentarians, as it is the case in Lebanon now. Maybe the leader of the Free Army will become a deputy in the future, and this is normal. Regarding what is happening on the northern borders in Lebanon, the first defense line is formed of Islamic factions. In eastern Qalamun, those who are fighting ISIS are the Free Army factions, أحرار الشام and هيئة تحرير الشام. This is something that might not be covered by the Lebanese media for known reasons. Hezbollah is currently trying to transform the Free Army to a militia working under its umbrella in order to form this buffer zone and to bring back Syrian refugees to these zones in order to create a certain type of stability. This project might be successful because the regime will not go back to these zones, and this is the only guarantee for those refugees to come back. So the regime will not have the possibility to enter these zones and arrest people. Al-Qalamun is a very sensitive region. If ISIS was to invade Lebanon, it would invade it from Al-Qalamun region. I will try to answer the question regarding the future of Syria because Malik talked on the long term, but I prefer to talk about the medium term. Regardless of who will govern, let us say that the economy is totally destroyed and rebuilding it will require long years. And it is not true that agricultures will be able to come back and start working from the first day because all the infrastructure is destroyed, and this will require years of reconstruction. The return of refugees and displaced is a very complicated process, and this requires capital. This requires international assistance, foreign investments, all types of funding in order to launch the reconstruction phase, whether systematically or non-systematically. Let us not forget the euro issue and the position taken by the United States. Let us not forget the impact of the oil prices, the war in Yemen. This means that the Gulf countries will not be able to offer a very generous assistance. Let us not expect this. So all these factors mean that regardless of who will regime be, the major issue will be providing the needs of the Syrian people and providing the needs of the relevant stakeholders within this alliance. So I think that the major crisis will be within this group of persons who have been able to win the war, if I may say. Why Rami Makhlouf is still exerting his control over the imports and exports in Syria, for example. Let us not forget that the reconstruction should be implemented in all regions, and at the end of the day, for the regime to be able to ensure the stability, it will have to reconstruct all regions, even the regions that were controlled by the opposition.
Regardless of who this person is, may it be Saddam Hussein, still in, Bashar Assad, of course they need two things. First of all, a kind of satisfaction among these citizens in order to contribute to the political process. And I think that at all these levels, Syria will be concerned and anxious about these different levels, and we add to all of that the return of the refugees. It's not only a matter of, okay, now we have peace, come back. No. It's a complex process, and it is very important for the Lebanese and for the Jordanians to understand that. Why Assad remains? What is his justification? It could sound a simple question, but let me tell you, it is very clear that he will not remain. There are many entities that have wagered on Russia's or even Iran's ability to twist his arm even and force him to resign, but this was not the case. Even as we hear from the West, when they say that had the Russians and the Iranians known their interest, they would have done this or that. It's as if they want Russia and Iran to do what they were not able to do, which is to topple Assad. This is the first answer, but there is also something else I would like to mention. We have many challenges. If foreign entities do not invest in taking out Assad, Russia and Iran wanted or want to settle the situation rather than take out Assad, and this is very clear. All the political and societal dynamics could come back even after the war, after the violence. Everyone is marginalized except those who carry arms. So, in order to have new, effective entities in the different walks of life in Syria, we need to move on from violence to somewhere else. Even in the opposition comes out from the same incubator or from other social incubators, such as the pro or the entities that are pro their denominations or pro-regime or whatever. It's not a matter of, well, he did what he wanted to do and now it's time for bye-bye. No, some think that this is the game, but it's not. Whenever there are other needs and other demands from other social categories from within the regime's camp, I think only then we can start thinking of other alternatives, but they could happen 1, 3, or 6 years from now. The problem here is, if I take into account the intermediary scenario where Syria is concerned and anxious, it does not have capital, it cannot reconstruct, humanitarian aid, as mentioned by Sultan, and the role of NGOs internationally and locally will be extremely important. The state has been living on humanitarian aid. And then, after the war, if this remains, then we will talk once again about NGOs government-owned NGOs, we will talk about civil sector, humanitarian aid. Everyone can create any NGO and make a living out of it. So in this situation, I think that we will find Assad to be more suitable to be in the heart of such relations or this relations network between the army and the institutions, so that in the future Syria will become one of these networks and everyone will be making a living from informal channels rather than from the state institutions. Within this structure, Assad will remain needed internally to become the link between these networks, or at least he will be the most capable of running this network. There was another question on Geneva. I think that we have reached a point of no return when it comes to Turkey. The impact of what happened last August can be seen very clearly, and this is why they cannot go back. They cannot get back what they have paid. We will see what will happen next. Reem Turkmani's question concerning Geneva, let me tell you very briefly. In my opinion, and from the first moment, not one foreign entity except for Iran, and even not all of Iran, but partially, had sufficient interest to invest the political, non-military capital in Syria to reach a solution. Today we are on the 14th of March. On the 16th of March 2012, the Annan plan was issued. It included the 6 points from the Security Council, and then Geneva won by the end of June 2012. Since that point, and despite the fact that Western countries withdrew from their demand of the necessity of toppling Assad, to the extent that the Security Council issued a resolution on that which was vetoed by China and Russia, they withdrew from that opinion and they started asking and demanding for negotiations and a ceasefire and the transition of power. So this withdrawal from their earlier position was actually rational because they weren't ready for the taking down of Assad, and at the same time they couldn't guarantee a commitment to the ceasefire and to true negotiations and the sharing of power. So, honestly speaking, the whole Geneva process is linked to that. All countries had to go to the easiest channels, such as sanctions. Western countries usually follow sanctions. They define the sanctions for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. Look at Cuba, look at Myanmar, Libya, Iraq. The sanctions remained for years, but nothing changed. Because this is the easiest and the most cost-effective option to truly convince the Iraqis or the Chinese or the Russians to truly find a solution in Syria. They did not do. And despite all that, we find that there are some who want, or at least 1 million, who would like to follow what is or what took place in Geneva to reach a real solution. I disagree with Sultan. He said that there's only one solution. I say no, we have many solutions. But to talk about one official solution, such as the Taif Agreement or the Oslo Agreement, will not happen. There will be a de facto agreement, a de facto solution with political outcomes. And this could be accompanied by reconciliations from inside Syria. It could be a Syrian agreement that the Syrians would come to by Syrian dialogue, but there will be no agreement that is considered to be one formal agreement signed by the Assad regime. This will not happen. Also, there was a question on the role of Iran. Iran is one of the countries that greatly invested in Syria. What do you expect Iran's conditions to be? What will its share be in Syria for the future? We are always afraid of the Iranian boogeyman, which is clouding our thinking, especially in the Gulf. We say Iran wants to take its share in Syria, to take land, to take this and that, but all this is nothing if we put it on top of each other. Iran is investing billions in Kazakhstan, which is an Islamic country. Most of its citizens are Sunnis, not Shiites, and they're not attempting to change them into Shiites because there is a certain Iranian economic vision for Central Asia. Now they have a train road from Kazakhstan to all the way to the heart of Central Asia. So it will not be vandalism in Syria, it will be investment in Syria and reconstruction. But there are armed factions, yes, but it's just to create certain havoc. I don't think that the government has control over all of the factions in Syria or in Iraq or elsewhere. So this is also highly unlikely. So I don't think Iran has long-term projects to benefit from Syria because they are actually focusing on Central Asia. Can't we have or draw some parallels with their role in Lebanon? I prefer not to talk about Lebanon. Another point I would like to stress, we need to have leadership that has true moral authority in Syria. The current situation is problematic because there is no true moral authority that allow them to gather the people around any issue. And the leadership that was created in the beginning was marginalized, and their role was weakened. Another issue is the issue of the opposition that is allowed to make oppositions. These groups that go to Beirut, go to Geneva from Damascus. So they are allowed to travel, they are allowed to oppose, but according to certain ways. This reminds us of Gaddafi when he used to go on demonstrations and participate in demonstrations against his government. This is opening the opportunity to non-hostile opposition, which is influencing international decisions and tendencies. So these are just certain additions to the complex situation I've already drawn. Now, concerning Trump's administration and its intentions, and whether it has any readiness to enter into the region after the nuclear agreement. As long as the nuclear agreement is there, Trump administration could use it to impose a strict implementation of that agreement on Iran. So in Iran's shoes, I would preserve my position in Syria and in Lebanon in case there could be any future developments with the United States and the nuclear agreement. In addition to Iraq, which we did not mention, with the withdrawal of Daesh in Mosul and in Syria in the next 2 years, the true battle in Iraq will be in Baghdad, not in Mosul. It will be the battle of authority over the Iraqi state. This is the true battle, and it is much more dangerous than Baghdad. And if the Iranians are aware, they will start focusing on Iraq as of now. Because on one hand, they have a motive not to dwarf their presence in Syria, taking into account the possible US policy, and because the developments in Iraq will scare them, but they will also put on them burdens that are much heavier than the burdens in Syria, because this will influence their movement and their investment not only in Iraq but also in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, anywhere. Because wherever they wanted to change the burden to the peripheries, the better it would be for them. So to have 2,000 or even 10,000 soldiers on the borders here will not be enough. The situation in Syria will remain unsecure. But how will Hezbollah or Iran or Russia withdraw from this burden coming from Syria if the regime that they fought to save will find itself always weak, always anxious, always worried, and requiring assistance? This is one burden. And if Iraq develops to become another burden over Iran with a Shiite struggle, or a struggle between the Shiite militias and parties over controlling the Iraqi state, this will be an important strategic burden over Iraq or for Iran. So I think that Iran needs to look into the situation of Iraq as well. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attendance. We hope you join us in future seminars. Thank you.